Good morning and welcome to the sixth lecture on ethics. Today we are going to discuss the subjective schools of meta-ethics. There are many subjective schools, as you would notice when we discuss during this lecture, and we shall begin with the simple subjectivism. In my introduction to meta-ethics, I already mentioned to you one of the important questions that meta-ethics raises is, what is the meaning of good or bad when you use these terms in morality? Simple subjectivism responds to this question by saying, when someone says X is good or something is good, he merely means that I like X or I like something. Similarly, if I were to say X is bad, all that I mean is X is what I like. I dislike. So good means what I like, bad means what I dislike. So this school basically states a principle that we need to pick out our moral principles only by following the preferences that we have. If I prefer something, then I make it to be a moral principle for myself because that's what I like. If I don't prefer something, then I cannot make that a moral principle for me because I don't like it. That's what I hate. So good is what I like or what I prefer. Bad is what I dislike or what I do not prefer. There are two important components in this school, which is normally known as the two versions of the school. There is an ontological version and there is a semantic version. Ontological basically means the existence of something. So in this case, do moral facts or moral truths exist objectively? That means independent of us. Do they have an existence independent of us who are subjects? So from that point of view, the school would say ontologically there are no objective moral truths. Moral truths do not exist objectively. They don't exist independent of us. From the semantic point of view, semantic basically means the meaning. When I speak about morality, so the meaning that I attribute to the statement that I make, do they have objective status? Do I make an objective claim to the moral statement that I make? This school would say, from the semantic point of view, I do not claim any objective status whatsoever to the moral claims I make. For example, if I say lying is bad, I am not claiming an objective meaning to the sentence I just state. When I say lying is bad, the meaning I confer on that particular sentence is I just don't like lying. So there is no objective status to the moral claim that I make from the meaning point of view. It has no ontological status, it has no objective semantics as well. Therefore, all moral statements that we make are necessarily true. Why all moral statements are true? Because all that I say when I make a moral statement is merely my preferences. When I speak about my preferences, I cannot be wrong, I can only be right. It's like when I say coffee is good, all that I mean is I like coffee and I cannot be wrong in my claim that I make with regard to my preferences. Therefore, moral statements are similar to that. And all moral statements that we make are necessarily true. This is the important aspect of this school. There are definitely some advantages in this school because it emphasizes on our individual freedom. Morality is based on my free choice, what I prefer. So I'm not constrained by someone else's dictates. Also, it accords with how we form our moral beliefs. Normally we form our moral beliefs according to what our preferences are. Our moral beliefs are formed in and through the preferred choices that we make in our life. So these are the two important advantages in this school. There is one basic objection that is posed to the school. The objection is very simple. This school is contradictory, or the claim of the school is contradictory. Why does this critic say that? It is because we hear people saying, I like smoking, but smoking is bad. Now, according to simple subjectivism, smoking is bad means I dislike smoking. So when someone says, I like smoking, but smoking is bad, the person says, I like smoking, but I dislike smoking. That's a contradiction in terms. You cannot merely say that I like smoking on the one hand, I dislike smoking on the other hand. It cannot go together. Either you like smoking or you dislike smoking. But the proponents of this school would reply to this criticism by saying, well, you need to look at the immediate effect and the long-term consequences of the action. When I say, for example, I like smoking, I'm speaking about the immediate satisfaction I get, the enjoyment of smoking that I have. But when I say smoking is bad, which also means I dislike smoking, I am referring to the long-term consequences that it will have on my health. I dislike smoking for the long-term consequences it might have on my health. So I like smoking for the immediate gratification that it gives me, but I also dislike smoking for the ill health that I may inherit from smoking. So these are not contradictions really. They are saying this. They are saying things from two different points of view. This is how they would reply to this objection. But there are other objections to this. If we take simple subjectivism seriously, if simple subjectivism were to be true, all moral disagreements would be an illusion. Strictly speaking, we cannot really disagree with one another from the moral point of view. For example, when someone says abortion is right or morally permissible, the person merely speaks about his or her preference, namely he or she dislikes or disapproves of abortion. If someone says abortion is morally wrong, then that person merely states his or her preference that he or she dislikes or disapproves that action. So in the first place, when the person says abortion is right, the person is not disapproving abortion. It's a matter of the person's preference. In the second case, when another person says abortion is wrong, the person is disapproving the act because of the preferences the person has. So if it is a matter of preference, can we really disagree on moral issues? It's like when somebody says, well, coffee is good, another person says tea is good, and both by that they mean basically what their preferences are. Can there be a disagreement? This is one serious problem, but we do disagree constantly about moral issues in life. In the absence of disagreement, we cannot arrive at a possible way out. The fact that there are differences of thinking and we disagree is the way we come to resolve it. It doesn't even allow that possibility. Now, there are also other objections. If we take again simple subjectivism very seriously, all the moral judgments we make are true. So the moral judgments that Hitler makes, that killing Jews is morally okay or morally right, is as true as somebody who disapproves the killing of Jews. So his statement is not to be considered false and the other statement is to be considered true, because both are true according to simple subjectivism. If Hitler says killing Jews is okay, then it is true, morally true. And if someone else says killing Jews is wrong, that is also morally true. So we cannot be wrong in making our moral judgment. So what is the problem with that? And if everybody is right, then obviously we are not going to resolve the problem. What are we going to do? Are we going to kill people or we are not going to kill people. We cannot arrive at a decision. That is a serious problem. Besides that, Hitler's statement is as true as a human activist claim is. For example, Martin Luther King, his statement about racism is wrong is as true as Hitler's statement racism is right. So both are equally true. So that creates a problem as to which one to follow. The next school we are going to discuss is the subjectivism of J.L. Mackie. J.L. Mackie is known for his moral skepticism. Skepticism is a position which doubts the existence of any objective moral facts, and that is why it is moral skepticism. Skepticism basically means an attitude of doubt, and in this case it is on morality. Therefore they doubt if there are any moral objective facts. And Mackie would say there are no good reasons to believe in the existence of objective moral facts. Mackie also came up with what is known as the error theory. The error theory is basically an assumption that claims to objective moral facts are false. I will explain that in a moment, what this error theory is all about. Mackie slightly nuances the simple subjectivism with one major difference. Mackie makes three arguments to prove his point. The argument from relativity, argument from queerness, and argument from projection. We will look at each of these arguments in detail in a moment. Now, what is this argument from relativity? Mackie tells us, what is our moral experience? When we look at people with whom we live, with diverse cultures, diverse take on moral issues, we notice that morality is very much culturally dependent. Not all people adhere to a universal moral code. People think differently when it comes to morality depending on the culture in which they are born, in which they are raised. There is a vast difference in the way moral codes are formed. What is right in one society is seen as wrong in another society from a moral point of view. So there is no one agreement, which means morality is relative to cultures. There is no one universal moral code. If there is no one universal moral code, then there is no point in talking about objectivity in morality. Because if it is relative to culture and dependent on the people in the culture, it is the people in the culture who have constructed it according to their preferences. So it is very subjective, that it cannot be objective. That is the first argument that he presents for his school. The second argument is the argument from queerness. Queerness means something strange, something that is foreign or alien, something which normally we have not experienced. Now, Mackie wants to tell us it is not possible to support the existence of objective moral facts, because anything that is objective, we may be able to see it, investigate it through natural science. Suppose when I say there is a table right in front of me, it can be verified, it can be investigated. Or suppose if I say the earth is of certain billion years old, through certain scientific methods, it can be verified. So then it can become an objective truth, that which can be established beyond any contestation. Nobody can contest that. Whereas when we say anything about morality, where do these objective facts exist? Where do objective moral facts exist? Anything about nature, we do know. Anything about material reality, we can establish it to be true. When we speak about morality, how do we really establish them, and where do they exist? And if they do exist, that would be a kind of a strange thing, of a very different kind of thing. And that would be a queer thing. queer, something very strange from what would be normally our experience in everyday life. And this is the second argument that he presents. The third argument is the argument from projection. Now, this is technically a psychological word. Oftentimes we do use this even in our everyday language. We project your fears onto others, for example. This is what you are undergoing, but you are projecting it outside of you and say something else, the problem somewhere else. And the problem is within you. Similarly, Mackey thinks that basically we are projecting our subjective beliefs into the world outside of us, into the objective world. So there are no such things as objective values. They are merely our subjective beliefs. So you believe in certain things to be true or certain to be morally right, and merely you project to the outside world, and then you call that an objective value. For example, if somebody says that honesty is an objective value, well, that is what you believe. Because of your belief, you just project it to the outside world and claim that it is an objective moral truth. Hume has already stated this. Mackey takes inspiration from Hume. Hume, empiricist from a Scottish philosopher and empiricist. He has said that the notion of morality or immorality is basically something that we project from our feelings. There is nothing as moral or immoral. It is something what we feel and we project it outside of us, that emerges from within our feelings. Feelings are subjective, they are not objective. Mackey calls this a pathetic fallacy. The pathetic fallacy because we are making a mistake, that's why it's a fallacy. What is the mistake that we make? The mistake we make is to read our feelings into the world of objects. So we have some subjective feelings, subjective beliefs about morality. We just read them in the objective world, and that is very pathetic way in which we try to deal with morality, and that is why it is a pathetic fallacy. Morality, therefore, for Mackey is a human invention. Now, the same idea is already echoed in the philosophy of the Greek philosopher Xenophon, who said that religion is an invention. In fact, we make God in our own image or in the image of our group. Similarly, Mackey says we create morality and claim objectivity to it. It is a subjective construction, but we claim an objective status to that every time when we speak about morality. It's a fallacy, but we keep doing it. And perhaps for Mackey, it is not all that bad we do it. It is perhaps necessary. I quote him. In his own words, I quote, "We need morality to regulate interpersonal relations, to control some of the ways in which people behave towards one another, often in opposition to contrary inclinations." The contrary inclinations could be that we can be very destructive towards one another, but society cannot go on. So contrary to that, we need to control some of the ways in which people behave towards one another, and therefore that's the only way we can regulate interpersonal relations. Norms are formed because of this. I continue his quote. "We therefore want our moral judgments to be authoritative for other agents as well as for ourselves. Objective validity would give them the authority required." So we need to have some authority to control the behavior of others towards one another. And what gives legitimization for that is an objective validity. So though it is not objective, we claim objective validity to that to ensure society does not run into chaos. The society somehow hangs together. There is no big problem within the society in the interpersonal relationship. So it's a human invention, maybe it is for the good of humanity. Now that we have discussed enormously about Mackey, let us come to the difference that he has with the simple subjectivism. We already discussed there are two components or the two versions, the ontological and the semantic. The ontological version merely states there are no objective moral facts or moral truths. The semantic would be from the simple subjectivism point of view. When I speak also, the meaning I give to the moral statement is not an objective meaning, it's merely a subjective meaning. I'm only speaking about my preference. Mackey makes a change here. From the point of view of ontological version, he agrees with the simple subjectivism. There are no objective moral facts. Yes. But from the point of view of semantic version, he makes a U-turn. He says, unlike the claim of the simple subjectivism, every time I make a moral statement, I claim objective status to the moral claim that I make. So I claim an objective status. I claim the meaning that this moral statement I make is an objective meaning, while in fact objective moral truths do not exist. That is why we are in error. So hence the theory of error. Therefore, all the moral statements we make are false. Why they are false? There is a disconnect between the ontological component and the semantic component. Ontologically, moral facts do not exist. But when I speak, I claim objectivity to the meaning of the statement that I make, the moral statement I make. So there is a total disconnect between these two. Therefore, I am in error. I am wrong in the statement I make. So all moral statements people make are false. Everybody does the same. So that is why all moral statements we make are false. All the criticism that we have said about simple subjectivism can also be said about subjectivism of Mackie. I don't want to repeat them. So we'll move to the next school, cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is a very fascinating school because this is also used in many of the social sciences and the anthropological studies as well. Basically, it says morality is a product of culture. Morality is created by a cultural society in which we live. So if my culture permits something, then it becomes morally right. If my culture prohibits something, then it is morally wrong. So what is permissible by my culture is what makes it right. What is prohibited by my culture is what makes it wrong. So it is morally wrong to do something means it is prohibited by my culture. If it is morally right means it is permitted by my culture. That is a simple way in which cultural relativism can be understood. The implication is morality is not the same everywhere. It is relative from culture to culture. It is related to the culture. So what is right in one culture need not be right in another culture. As the common English adage goes, what is food for one is poison for another. So some of the key points of this cultural relativism is morality is a product of culture, and cultures differ from one another with regard to morality, and there is no clear way in which we can resolve these differences that exist between cultures. So they are product of culture and we need to accept as such. So every cultural moral code is to be respected. We need to learn to be tolerant towards the morality of other cultures. We cannot claim superiority. My culture, what it says is right, the other culture, what it says is wrong, because every culture has equal right to exercise its own moral principles or moral norms and to live by them. So one of the strengths they would claim is, well, ours is a theory that promotes tolerance towards other cultures. It makes us give up I am right, you are wrong kind of mentality, when tolerance is required in order that we don't claim superiority over others. Only our culture is right, your culture is wrong. We don't need to have that. In fact, it's not the right spirit in morality according to this particular school. One of the important objections to this school is cultural relativism demands conformity to the culture. It also implicitly assumes if morality is a product of culture, we cannot really disagree with our culture, because after all it is a culture that has produced the moral code, and it is a culture which has socialized us into following that, and technically you cannot disagree with that. So you have to conform to that. Conformity is a necessary requirement of each individual. Conformity to the cultural norm, the cultural society, the expected standards of behavior. But our experience is we constantly disagree with the values of our society. Not only we constantly disagree with the values of the society, in fact, it is a disagreement that has given rise to changes in the society. If people have not disagreed with certain practices in the society, we would not have probably changed many things. If people have not raised serious questions about the practice of apartheid or racism, our society would still be infected with racism or casteism or class inequality. At least in principle, people are critical about it, even if you have not completely eradicated it. So we constantly keep disagreeing with the values that our culture projects as value. So this is one of the important objection to this cultural relativism. Let us apply this cultural relativism in the case of racism or in the case of moral education. What this theory would hold is, if a cultural society believes or it has constructed morality, namely racism is morally right, then it would be perfectly morally permissible. It would be the right thing to do. Practicing segregation on the basis of color is morally right. Would that be something that would be acceptable to us today? Let us try and apply this to moral education. If in one cultural society moral education is given in such a way that you are to practice honesty, you have to be man with integrity, and in other culture it says exactly the opposite, both cultures are right. So is that what we would like to have? People would have a different sets of values, and if people have different sets of values, what happens? Across cultures, can people really interact? Can people really come to terms with one another? It's going to create conflict and rift rather than agreement, consensus, and collaboration. However, cultural relativism, as I told you, claims that it helps to deal with other cultures. One of the reasons it says it helps to deal with other cultures is, well, we promote tolerance. After all, every cultural norms are equally valid. So I don't need to disregard other cultures and their cultural norms. I can respect them, I can tolerate them. Now the question that critics would ask is tolerance toward other cultures necessarily good? This criticism can be seen from 2 points of view, from within the argument of the cultural relativism itself. Cultural relativism tells us tolerance is something that it promotes towards other cultures. But then the question the critics would ask cultural relativists would be, what happens if a particular cultural society does not think of tolerance as a value? Why should you promote tolerance? That would have a serious problem. And after all, to say tolerance is a value, if you say it is part of your cultural product, another culture can equally say tolerance is not a value for them, it's not part of our cultural product. If you say no, irrespective of your culture, you need to be tolerant, then you are claiming tolerance as an objective value that is self-defeating. You are going against your own argument. Also, from another point of view, should we be tolerant towards other cultures even if other cultures are doing something absolutely condemnable, something that is horrid? A culture which is involved in practice of child abuse, or for example of practice of human sacrifice, should you say you should be tolerant towards those cultures? Is tolerance always necessarily good? Should we not stand up and raise our voice against that and condemn that? Another important question is, if cultural relativism claims that we can deal with other cultures better, the question critics would raise is, does cultural relativism really help us to arrive at some common norms between cultures, common values between cultures? Can people accept certain things as common across cultures? The answer is obviously no. If the answer is no, then would not cultures remain as individual isolated islands without having a point of encounter, without having a point in which they can converge, they can interact, intersect, and they can mutually enrich one another? That possibility is not there. It does not lead to some kind of commonality across cultures, without which relationship between cultures is not possible. The third criticism would come towards cultural relativism from the quarters of objectivists or those who believe in objective morality. They would say, should we always accept, should we always say that should we give up always our right to say we are right, you are wrong? Because certain things we may be convinced that we are right and others are wrong. For example, take the example of child marriage or the practice of sati. After all, it are the European people from European cultures who found it wrong and condemned it. It is because it is from the European circle, are we going to say, well, it's outside of our culture and therefore we cannot accept it? Do we not today think in retrospect, well, what they did was right? Were they not in a way right that the practices that we had were wrong? So did they not have a right to say that they were right and we were wrong? And did they not have a right to have certain objective measures or standards by which they could condemn certain practices that we had? So these are some of the questions and challenges that are also posed before cultural relativism. Not even between cultures, but within one's own culture, we do have problems. While cultural relativism claims tolerance towards others, would it be tolerant towards people who dissent? Within the culture, there are people who would disagree with the values that that particular culture promotes. Would it be tolerant towards them? The answer is clearly no, because that somehow challenges their own construction. That is why people who challenge certain cultural values are often targeted, they are isolated, they are even harassed, and sometimes they are put to death. They say they are danger to the society. Most revolutionaries are often targeted by these cultural groups because they somehow destabilize what is constructed by the society as a moral value or a moral norm. What about the subgroup problem again? There are also people within the culture, there are subcultures within the culture, and they may have different practices. Would this cultural relativism be tolerant towards them for the differences in their practices or differences in the moral values and norms they have? Again, that is a serious question mark. Another important objection to cultural relativism is some actions are objectively wrong regardless of what you think or what you feel, regardless of what a particular culture thinks or feels. One such example is racism. Racist actions are objectively wrong. You may think anyway, you may feel anyway, that doesn't matter. Whatever you feel, whatever your cultural group thinks or feels, it doesn't matter. Irrespective of what your opinion is on that matter, these are wrong. Or in a more general way, murder is objectively wrong, unless if it is for defense. In the general cases, murder is objectively wrong. There are certain things that are to be considered objectively wrong. You cannot say, well, in my cultural group it is fine, therefore I do it. So that would be a serious problem again. Now we will move on to another school, which is emotivism. This also a subjective school. But so far we have been discussing three schools: simple subjectivism, subjectivism of J.L. Mackie, and the cultural relativism. All these schools belong to the cognitive schools of metaethics. I made a distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive in my lecture on Introduction to Metaethics. Cognitive statement is a proposition that can be shown to be true or false. Non-cognitive statements are not propositions at all. I gave example not from the moral context, from other contexts. For example, when I say go to hell, now that is not a proposition that can be said to be true or false. It is raining outside, now that is a proposition that can be verified to be true or false. Or give me a pen, that is not a proposition to be verified as true or false. That is merely a command. A command or an outburst of expression or a request These things cannot be shown to be true or false. Only statements, straightforward propositions with subject and predicate, they can be shown to be true or false, and only those propositions are cognitive. Now, emotivism is not cognitive because this school thinks that in fact the moral statements we make are not really statements at all. They are outbursts of our emotions. And this school is also known as the ethical non-naturalism. Basically, it means our morality can be understood purely as an emotional response. Now, note, it is not an emotional response in statements. It is merely expressions of emotions, not even assertions of emotions. It is not like, I feel happy. That is an assertion of my emotion. Now, that's a statement. That can be verified, whether I look happy or not, whether I have a smiling face or not. But the expression of happiness like, ha, hooray, well, that cannot be verified to be true or false. They are mere outbursts of expressions. They are not statements in the first place to be verified to be true or false. Now, this idea traces back to again the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who says ethics is a matter of sentiments or feelings. And this idea was later taken up by Alfred Ewell Ayer, commonly known as A.J. Ayer, who developed this school called emotivism. Now, Alfred Ewell Ayer, you might have probably studied as part of philosophy or science. He is known as a logical positivist. Now, logical positivism comes up with what is known as a verification principle. What is a verification principle? The language that we use or the statement that we make is meaningful either if it is positively verified, it is empirical, or it is analytical. A true statement is a statement that can be verified to be true or false, either empirically or the statement is analytical. Now, that is logical positivism. If it is analytical, it is a logical statement, logical proposition. An example of a logical proposition which is analytical means a bachelor is unmarried. Now, analytic statement means it doesn't say anything new. The predicate is already contained in the subject. The bachelor is unmarried. The unmarried doesn't say anything new to the subject. So it is a true statement. It is analytic. Now, Kant made this famous distinction, synthetic judgment and analytic judgment, right? And synthetic judgment is something in which the predicate contains something new. For example, a bachelor is a happy man. Now, happiness is not necessarily implied in the word bachelor, but now you are saying something new about the bachelor. Now, bachelor is an unmarried man is an analytic statement because the aspect of being unmarried is already implied in the word bachelor. That is why it's an analytic statement. So, only analytical statements can be true. Otherwise, the statement must be empirically verifiable. And this theory is known as the verification principle of logical positivism. Now, Ayer thought we cannot apply this verification principle in religious and moral beliefs because these religious and moral statements are not analytic statements, nor are those statements empirically verifiable. So, moral statements are not analytic, they are not empirically verifiable. Then, what are moral statements? Moral statements, according to him, has a particular kind of language which he calls an ethical language, and the nature of this language is merely to express our feelings. The feelings about something that we like or we do not like, or feelings about our approval or our disapproval. So technically, when someone says lying is wrong, all that the person says is boo, lying. It's an expression. It can be sometimes shown in a face, but in a simple word like boo, hurrah. If you are joyful, you say hurrah. If you are angry, you say hurrah. I mean, these are different kind of words that you use. When you are in pain, for example, when you are playing basketball, the ball comes and hits you, or you kind of slip and fall, and then there is a pain in your ankle. There is a twist in the ankle, let's assume. Your ligament is broken. And then you begin to say, ouch! It's an expression of your pain. It's not a statement. So moral statements are basically expressions of your feelings. Note again, as I told you a while ago, they are not assertions of feelings. Assertions become statements. It's like saying, I feel sad, I feel angry. They are statements. But merely expressing the anger like, hoo, or pain, ouch, or joy, hurrah, they are not statements. They cannot be empirically verified. So ethics is a matter of subjective feelings. They are merely expressions of emotions, and that is why this theory of Ayer is often known as boo-hurrah theory. Boo means something I disapprove, hurrah means something I approve, and expression of feelings are some kind of words that we use. One of the important strengths in Ayer's emotivism, it has a strength of command. Now, what do we mean by strength of command? Moral statements, because they arouse feelings, they exercise a certain command in us. Ayer believes that a moral imperative like ought is less influential compared to the emotion. Emotions have certain intensity by which it can persuade you into action. In fact, Ayer thinks emotions are the best motivations. Unless you are emotionally moved about something, you will not act. So it is not merely somebody says you ought to do something you are not going to do. Emotionally, there is something that disturbs you for the fact that you didn't do it. Then of course you will do it. So we have many experiences of that, how emotions can be powerfully a motivating factor. In the life of Gandhi, after all, it is said, one of the reasons he decided to follow the Brahmacharya life is that emotion of certain ways in which he felt what he did was wrong, he couldn't forgive himself for what he did, etc., etc. Then there is an emotion of pain, there is an emotion of anger towards himself, and that has motivated him to adopt a certain principle, rightly or wrongly, that's another matter. But the point of the matter is, emotions are powerful motivations for us to do something or even not to do something. That would be what is called the strength of command. Emotions have the strength of command. It commands us to do certain things in a much better way. I have already explained this, the distinction between the asserting your feeling and expressing your feeling. Assertions can be true or false, but expressions are not. Now, the central idea of emotivism is moral claims are not really assertions, though they look like assertions. They are merely expressions of feeling. So it's like a ra, boo, or hurrah kind of thing. Unlike other emotive expressions, ethical emotive expressions have a tendency to persuade people. It has a magnetic effect on the listeners. And this is what exactly from the childhood onwards we have been conditioned. So when people react to certain things, they express their feelings to certain things in a negative way, we personalize it and we begin to also respond to them in the negative way. Suppose if your parents were always reacting to, for example, the question of abortion in a negative way, you personalize that as you also, so much that you also begin to react to that in a negative way. In other words, you begin to think that it is wrong. But it is the emotion that has persuaded, it has a magnetic effect on you, not because they have made a reasonable argument with you. So this is what happens right from the childhood as part of our socializing process. So therefore, a fuller account of emotivism is not merely, expression of emotion, but also an appeal. Please accept this as something what I am persuading you to do. Accept this attitude that I have. So there is a persuasion that is part of it. That would be the fuller understanding of emotivism. Now, one of the important advantages of emotivism is it captures the link between ethics and emotions. Believe me, most ethical theories have left out this emotional component. It's all about theories, it's about logical reasoning, but we are not merely humans with logical reasoning, we are also humans with emotions. That link is missing. Now this has captured that link. So to that extent, it merits our attention. So that is a major advantage of this particular school. There are also other advantages, like it can explain our moral disagreement. Because when somebody says, somebody is having a expressing something positively towards something, another person expressing negatively towards something, it is not that one of the persons is wrong, the other person is right. It's because they have basically two different desires. Those desires conflict with one another. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything else. So that way, moral disagreement can be explained. The disadvantages of emotivism are numerous. One of the disadvantages is, if emotivism is right, then morality is not objective. If morality is not objective, then it doesn't make any sense in condemning other people's action as it is wrong action. Other people are mistaken about their moral views. You cannot say that, because after all, it is an expression of their feelings, nothing else. So there's no way in which you can say other people's moral views are wrong. Not even with other people, your own previous views on certain moral issues, you cannot even condemn that as wrong or criticize that as wrong, because after all, it was your emotion, expression of your emotion, nothing else. Also, the emotivist account of moral argument and moral deliberation does not distinguish between moral arguments that invoke false factual claims and that invoke true factual claims. We tend to think that moral attitudes formed under invoking true factual claim conditions are better justified than those formed under invoking false factual claim conditions. But people, just because they have a certain emotions towards something, they can invoke false factual claims and they can persuade you to adhere to that. There are numerous examples that we can give about that. For example, if somebody says capital punishment occasionally is right, then people can, kind of invoke false factual claim and play on your emotions. Well, they will say, most people who are condemned to the capital punishment were proved innocent later. Now, whether it is a true factual claim or a false factual claim. But then that somehow kind of makes you to think differently, because it is very persuasive, it plays on your emotions. If it is a false factual claim, then that can be used to influence your own moral views, your emotions, and therefore your moral views as well. This is one of the serious problems as well. Also, you may appeal to the person's interest to influence their emotions. Suppose you think abortion is wrong, and suppose your girlfriend happened to have had an abortion recently. It will make an appeal to your personal interest. People would say, do you mean to say your girlfriend is immoral? You see, it is playing on your emotions again. So these are the ways in which people may try to play on your emotions, either by appealing to your personal interest or by presenting you with false factual claims. You can also rely on psychological states of people to influence emotions. Suppose you are someone who is a forgiving, caring person, and your father was wronged by some criminal. You hold on to the opinion capital punishment is wrong because forgiveness is better. At that state of your psychological weakness, people will come and say, but you see that he is a criminal, he wronged your father, he murdered him, he's a rascal. Do you want him to go without justice? Playing on your emotions again. So these are some of the dangers that are associated with emotivism. Now finally, to conclude this part on emotivism, we will look at some of the weaknesses of emotivism. All that we said are weaknesses, but in a more pointed way. James Rachels comes with this criticism, namely, emotivism has removed reason from moral judgments. We appeal to reason in our morality. We appeal to reason in our morality as we appeal to reason for other aspects of our life as well. So reasons cannot be completely disconnected from morality, in as much as it cannot be disconnected from our other aspects of life. Well, emotions are important, but we cannot completely dismiss the role that reason plays. That's what exactly emotivism does. Also, the second criticism is there are certain cases where we find terrible crimes, organized crimes. For example, mass genocide that is done by some people. Are you going to say, well, my moral statement is merely a matter of expression of anger? It doesn't really condemn the act. An act like genocide is intrinsically wrong and it has to be condemned. You cannot simply say, well, I'm just merely expressing my emotion of anger towards that. Does it help? It doesn't help. And the third criticism is given by Peter Valli, who says, yes, emotivism is an ethical non-theory. Why it is an ethical non-theory? Because it discusses only emotions and does not deal with the idea of actions being ethical at all. So it does not discuss the idea of actions being moral. It merely speaks about your emotions. Therefore, it is a non-theory. It claims to be something on morality, but it's an ethical non-theory. It is not a theory. With this, we shall move on to the last school, which is known by different names, which is a subjective school, but it is a midway between subjectivism and objectivism to some extent. These are known by at least three different names: rational constructivism, often abbreviated as RC, or qualified attitude theory, abbreviated as QAT, or ideal observer view, abbreviated as IO. You would come across these different names that are used in different books. That's why I'm trying to give you all these three names, but this is one and the same theory. What is the meaning of the word good? When I say something is good, what do I mean? All that I mean is, I would desire X if I were fully informed and had an impartial concern for everyone. I'm not saying I desire X, or I like X, or I approve X. I would like it, I would desire it if I had the full information about it and if I had impartial concern for everyone. There is a condition, there is a qualification, that is, it's a qualified attitude theory. So it is also rationally constructed by means of certain process of reasoning, and that's why it is rational construction or rational constructivism. I'll explain why it is also ideal observer view in a moment. What is the basic idea of these things? Moral claims are not claims about our actual attitudes. It's not the attitude I have at this moment. They are basically claims about my attitudes and preferences when I situate myself in some ideal circumstance that are suitable for making moral judgment. Now, ideal circumstance. What do we mean by this ideal circumstance? Before that, what is the theory? In simple terms, when I say capital punishment is wrong, if I were ideally situated, if I am in an ideal circumstance, I would have negative attitude towards capital punishment. I would not approve of it. That's the point it makes. So what is this ideally situated or this ideal circumstance? It involves three important aspects. Ideal circumstance or ideal situated person is someone who is impartial. He or she is not personally involved in the situation. When you are personally involved in the situation, you begin to be partial. You begin to take sides with people. Now you detach yourself from that scenario. You situate yourself completely distant. That is an impartial way in which an impartial spectator, so to say. The second characteristic of this or aspect of this ideal circumstance or an ideally situated person is someone who is fully informed about the relevant facts. I cannot have only half facts. I should have all the facts that are relevant about the situation to make the correct moral judgment. I have the full knowledge about